Welcome to Human Monsters. It is doubtful if humanitarian principles have ever been responsible for failure to employ man-made epidemics, from naval aspects of biological warfare. Part 1. Historical Overview. Since the 1930s, the Chinese have viewed the Japanese with contempt. This arose from the actions of the Epidemic Prevention and Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The department is also known as the Manchurian Unit Number 731, or most commonly, and for brevity, Unit 731. In truth, the unit was a classified biological weapons research and development facility maintained by the imperialist Japanese army on the outskirts of Harbin province of northeastern China in Manchuria, which was controlled by the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese would become notorious for the horrific human rights abuses they inflicted on the Chinese at this time. Aside from slavery, torture, and mass executions, they went on to subject many Chinese nationals to medical experiments in Unit 731. Many of them were comparable to what prisoners of the Auschwitz concentration camps were subjected to under the supervision of Dr. Josef Mengele. Not only have contrition and compensation not been forthcoming from the Japanese government for the suffering that was inflicted on the victims of Unit 731, but for decades the government of Japan did all it could to bury information about the unit. It has been the Japanese people who have gradually exposed the nature of the unit's abuses through their own efforts. Throughout this episode, you will learn about what the victims endured. You may have noticed I didn't mention survivors. That is because there were no survivors. The human anatomy does not contain the organic resources to withstand the kind of experimentation that took place at Unit 731. However, the people who perished at Unit 731 were not defeated by hereditary weakness. They were tortured and murdered. The semantics are important to establish the difference. In all wars leading up to the Russo-Japanese conflict, it wasn't just guns, grenades, and related weaponry that generated casualties and inflicted bodily harm on Japanese soldiers. Disease was another factor altogether, contributing to suffering and death. For example, due to the unhygienic conditions of trenches, soldiers would be exposed to bacteria leading to trench mouth and other infections due to a lack of organic waste disposal. Other conditions were more life-threatening, such as beriberi or thiamine deficiency. Simply put, levels of vitamin B1 became dangerously low. Symptoms include weight loss, emotional instability, impaired sensory perception, weakness and pain in the limbs, irregular heartbeat, edema, a possible increase in the amount of the lactic acid and pyruvic acid in the blood. Most severe symptoms are high output cardiac failure and death. Another disease that was commonly contracted during war, and it continued beyond World War II, was dysentery. Symptoms of dysentery: diarrhea, mild stomachache, cramping, fever, nausea, vomiting, painful stools, intense abdominal pain, fatigue, bloody stool, weight loss, muscle aches. Sometimes the virus may spread beyond the intestines and infect other organs, including the brain. The Japanese military's scientists became leaders on a global scale when it came to illnesses contracted by soldiers in the line of duty. An American doctor, Louis Livingston Seaman, studied the phenomenon with the Japanese in their corner of the world. To quote Seaman, "The history of warfare for centuries has proven that in prolonged campaigns, the first, or open enemy, kills 20% of the total mortality in the conflict, whilst the second, or silent enemy, kills 80. This dreadful and unnecessary sacrifice of life, especially among the Anglo-Saxon races, is the most ghastly proposition of modern war, and the Japanese have gone a long way toward conquering or eliminating it. I unhesitatingly assert that the greatest conquests of Japan have been in the humanities of war, in the stopping of the needless sacrifice of life through preventable disease. In our war with Mexico, the proportion of losses was about 3 from disease to 1 from bullets, and in our great Civil War, nearly the same proportion obtained. No lessons seem to have been learned from these frightful experiences, for later statistics show no improvement. In the French campaign in Madagascar in 1894, 14,000 men were sent to the front, of whom 29 were killed in action and 7,000 perished from preventable disease. In the Boer War in South Africa, the English losses from disease were simply frightful, greater than even our Civil War record. But the crowning piece of imbecility was reserved for our war with Spain, where, in 1898, 14 were needlessly sacrificed to ignorance and incompetency for every one who died on the firing line or from battle casualties." He went on, indicating the fruits of the Japanese military scientists' labors. After examining a more recent conflict, only 1 2/10% of the entire army died of sickness or disease. Only 1 1/2 died of gunshot wounds. Although 24% were wounded, this record is, I believe, unparalleled and unapproached in the annals of war. Japan put into use the most elaborate and effective system of sanitation that has ever been practiced in war. For instance, every hospital throughout Japan and every base and field hospital in Manchuria has its bacteriological laboratory. Seaman had nothing but praise for, quote, "Japan's corps of trained experts with the microscope, that the dread phantom of disease might be intercepted." The Japanese were not only leaders in treatment, but also prevention of the spread of disease on the battlefield. They even invented a device that tests water for the presence of bacteria that can lead to the transmission of diseases. They went as far as to issue creosote pills to their soldiers so that they would be able to avoid contracting diseases spread through their food. The Japanese government were so committed to disease research and prevention that they started up the Department of Field Disease Prevention. As noble as its publicly declared intentions were, a dark side of their activities emerged, and it was as insidious as it was shrouded in secrecy. They undertook a program of finding a way to weaponize disease with the ultimate goal of winning war through bacterial warfare. It would be more cost-effective and less time-consuming to unleash a wave of malignant and terminal disease on your nemesis. The prospects of doing so were apparently so seductive to the Japanese government that they wasted no time in investigating how they may go about doing so. Part 2. Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was born on June 25, 1892, in Chiyoda, Japan. His family were wealthy and lived in relative luxury due to their possession of valuable real estate. In 1916, Shiro began his studies at Kyoto Imperial University. The institution was renowned for its medical program, especially its bacteriological research department. It was this course of study that attracted Shiro. Shiro Ishii would go down in history as a war criminal, and there were indicators early on that his personality was certainly at home in conflict situations. He was remembered for being disrespectful toward others, most often by being pushy, rude, and selfish. He was also never one to hesitate to stab his way up a mountain of backs to reach the summit of his field. Shiro felt that the military was one area where he could apply his knowledge and skills in bacteriology. After graduating from university in 1920, he enlisted in the Army. Shiro was promoted to lieutenant, and in the summer of 1922, he was transferred to the 1st Army Hospital in Tokyo. He was a highly dedicated and industrious researcher, and his contributions were highly appreciated by his superiors. 2 years later, he was reassigned to Kyoto Imperial University to study bacteriology more in depth. At the time, he managed to brown-nose his way into befriending the school's president. He even married his daughter. Marrying his way into the highest echelons of academic society at the school bestowed upon Ishii the power and influence he hungered for. In 1925, Japan signed the Geneva Convention. By having done so, they essentially agreed to negate the development, utilization, and deployment of biological and chemical weapons. This had an unexpected effect on Shiro Ishii. He was not at all discouraged by the development. His rationale was that if something were so nefarious that most of the world's nations saw fit to have it banished, then its effectiveness was undisputable in its certitude. Encouraged by this outcome, Shiro advocated for the creation of a military department that would focus on the development of biological weapons. Considering that this was his specialty, persuading the Army's general that biological warfare was the future would no doubt have elevated him politically and financially in the Japanese Army. The most significant selling point was the ways in which biological weapons would render armed conflict far more cost-effective. Test tubes and lab coats sure cost less than uniforms and the artillery they deployed. You can't take down an airborne virus with a gun. Among the most inhumane within the Japanese government and military at the time, this was a no-brainer, an apparent win-win. The way Ishii saw it, he could enlist the, quote, silent enemy as a, quote, silent ally. To consolidate his findings in research, he went on a worldwide fact-finding mission to learn about how chemical warfare was conducted during World War I, with particular emphasis on the use of gases. 1930. Japan's new Minister of the Army, Araki Sadao, met with Shiro Ishii. He listened to his pitch and the findings that backed up his argument. He was sufficiently impressed, so much so that he was sold. He would soon order the Army to organize a lab for developing biological weaponry. An epidemic prevention research laboratory in a wing of the Army Hospital in Tokyo was open for research. As expected, Shiro Ishii was installed in a management position, overseeing the entire operation. Quote-unquote prevention was both a euphemism and a misnomer. The truth was, this facility was used to create new bacterial and chemical weapons. Classically, scientists tested such materials on animals. Shiro Ishii was adamant that animal physiology would not provide the answers he was looking for. He wanted the certainty of knowing that a virus tested on a human would affect other humans in a comparable fashion. The Japanese government would soon find their human guinea pigs. During the Manchurian conflict, many Chinese nationals were unable to prevail against their Japanese attackers during the occupation. Those who survived would, in the long run, likely wish they hadn't. Other people plucked from the streets of China were accused of committing crimes. Basically, anything that was considered to be anti-Japanese, including verbally condemning them, would warrant an arrest. Following this were harsh interrogations and torture. Anybody whose actions considered to be consistent with one running afoul of the Japanese occupational regime's policies were rounded up and sent off to the labs. The division of the Japanese government that was tasked with gathering up Chinese subjects to be used as fodder for experiments were called the Kenpai-Tai, the Human Materials Procurement Wing of Unit 731. One officer, Mio Yutaka, reflected years later on his role as part of Kenpai-Tai. We were the special handling forces of the Kenpai-Tai, in charge of taking prisoners for the experiments of 731. We knew the prisoners would be used in experiments and not come back. We tied them with ropes around their waists and their hands behind the backs. They couldn't move. We took them by train in a closed car. Then the Unit 731 truck would meet us at the station. It was a strange truck, black with no windows, a strange-looking vehicle. Part 3. The Fortress and Bacteria Factory. The Chinese city of Harbin was biracial in population in those days. Russians had been in conflict with China and Japan, but many Russians settled in Harbin. When the Japanese moved toward the Russian border, they discovered that many Russian troops were stationed there. In fact, the Japanese army were outclassed in terms of numbers. Shiro Ishii identified this as a perfect opportunity to begin developing biological and chemical weapons in earnest. His cover story was that they were there to develop vaccines and other mainstream medical research for the prevention and treatment of illness. The Japanese military descended upon an indigent neighborhood called Beijing. There were 300 homes and some retail establishments in the area, with some open land in the south. A leading Japanese military figure told the village headman to evacuate all citizens in 3 days. The Japanese army occupied a building with about 100 rooms, using some as their personal quarters and others for research. All the houses in the neighborhood were burned to the ground by the army to ensure they would be able to experiment in privacy. The Japanese forced Chinese construction workers to build them their research facility, paying them very low wages and driving them like slave masters. The new building would contain a laboratory, a prison, a crematoria, a munitions storage area, living spaces, dining rooms, warehouses, and even a parking lot. The building would become known as Zhongma Fortress. Despite the best efforts of the Japanese army to keep the secret operations of Unit 731 confidential, it became commonly known among the Chinese population that not only was it a prison, but a factory that industrialized the production of bacteria and streamlined the process of execution like clockwork. According to a man who entered the building after it was abandoned, there were about 30 cells for housing human guinea pigs. There were always 500 to 600 people incarcerated there at any given time during the experimentation period. There was enough room to hold 1,000 people. Another Chinese national reported what he had heard about the unit. We heard rumors of people having blood drawn in there, but we never went near the place. We were too afraid. When construction started, there were about 40 houses in our village, and a lot of people were driven out. About one person from each home was taken to work on the construction. People were gathered from villages from all around here, maybe about 1,000 people in all. The only thing we worked on were the surrounding wall and the earthen walls. The Chinese that worked on the buildings were brought in from somewhere, but we didn't know where. After everything was finished, those people were killed. The prisoners wore leg shackles and sometimes hand shackles as well. They were given a substantial diet, their staples being rice or wheat, with meat or fish and sufficient vegetables, and at times even liquor. The purpose was to keep them in a normal state of health to yield useful data when they were subjected to the tests. One of these tests consisted of taking blood samples. At least 500 cubic centimeters was drawn at 2 to 3 day intervals. Some of the victims became progressively debilitated and wasted. Still, the blood drainage continued. Careful records were kept, and these experiments smack more of a combination of professional curiosity than of actual science. A simple, childlike curiosity to see how far a human being can be squeezed of blood until death occurs. Not all were drained to the point of death, though. Many were injected with poison when they could no longer serve as lab materials. Sometimes, when a subject was too weak to offer physical resistance, he would be killed with a blow to the head with an axe. The brain might then be used for further research. It is said that the life expectancy of prisoners at the fortress was a maximum of 1 month. An earlier experiment tried to determine how long a person could live on just water. Food was withheld from prisoners, and some were given only ordinary water, while others received only distilled water. They were observed as they wasted away and died. By protecting its soldiers from disease in the Manchurian conflict 30 years earlier, Japan had earned international admiration by establishing itself as the world leader in military medicine. Now, the direction into which it channeled its medical energies had changed, and its ethics began to twist and mutate as well. The leaders of Japan's military during the days of the Russo-Japanese War would undoubtedly have been appalled. Escape from Zhangma. In 1936, about 40 people managed to escape from Zhangma. An inmate known as Li planned the breakout for the 15th day of the 8th month. The commemoration of the change of seasons into autumn was to be observed cross-country at that time. Li knew the Japanese would celebrate the occasion, and that the guard overseeing his wing of Zhangma would be no exception. The prisoners would soon hand back their eating utensils to the guard. Li sent the guard to the floor with a blow to his head. He grabbed his keys from his belt and freed himself and all the other inmates on his dorm. Some were too weak to flee due to all the blood that was taken from them. Li left without them, knowing that certain death awaited him should he have remained there. As luck had it, there was a torrential downpour which deactivated the local electrical grid. Zhangma's searchlights and electrical wiring on their fences was therefore rendered inoperable, and Li led his fellow captives to freedom when he helped form a human ladder for everybody to climb over a fence. They ran as best they could with leg shackles. Some were shot and killed by Japanese military guards, Li among them. Others made it to villages and sought help from locals. Part 4. Ping Fang. The Japanese set up a new testing facility. The security measures were more severe. Even the airspace above was off limits. Offenders would be shot down. They even dug and filled a moat around this fortress. Some 70 buildings, this time built by a Japanese construction company, were erected. Construction has been estimated to have been finished around 1939. The number 8 block would house adult males. Another block would house children and adult females. Like guinea pigs, these people would be kept in veritable cages. The army were as secretive about the purpose of this facility as they were about what became known as Zhangma. The official explanation given to the Chinese population was that it was to be a lumber mill. One of the researchers heard about this explanation and said, "And the people are the logs." The Japanese word for log is maruta. The staff of Unit 731 would henceforth refer to the subjects of the barbaric experiments as marutas. Speaking about the crematoria in the building, one former staff member said, "The bodies always burned up fast because all the organs were gone. The bodies were empty." Ueda Yataro was one of the researchers. He documented some of his activities at Unit 731 from his writings. He was already too weak to stand. The heavy leg irons bit at his legs. When he moved, they made a dull, clanking sound. His fellow cellmates sat around him and watched him. Nobody spoke. The water in the toilet was running with an ominous sound. In the corridor outside the cell, the guards stood with their pistols strapped on. The commander of the guards was there also. The man's screams of death had no effect on them. This was an everyday occurrence. There was nothing special. To these guards, the people in here have already lost all rights. Their names have been exchanged for just a number written across the front of their shirts and the name Maruta. They are referred to only as Maruta number X. They are counted not as one person or two persons, but one log, two logs. We are not concerned with where they are from, how they came here. The man looked like a farmer covered with grime. He was wasting away, and his cheekbones protruded. His eyes glared out from the dirt and the tattered cotton clothes he was wrapped in. The team leader was fully pleased with yesterday's results. We never had such a typical change in blood picture and rate of infection, and I was eagerly looking forward to see what changes would be present in today's blood sample. With high hopes, I came to the number 7 cell block with the armed guards at my side. The Maruta I was working on was on the verge of death. It would be disastrous if he died. Then I would not be able to get a blood sample, and we would not obtain the important results of the tests we had been working on. I called his number. No answer came. I motioned through the window at the other 4 prisoners to bring him over. They sat there without moving. I screamed abusively at them to hurry up and bring him over to the window. One of the guards pulled out a gun, aimed it at them, and screamed in Chinese. Resigned, they gently lifted up the other man and brought him over to the window. More important to me than the man's death was the blood flowing in the human guinea pig's body at the moment just before his death. His hand was purplish and turning cold. He put his arm through the opening. I was elated, filled with a sense of victory and holding down my inexpressible excitement, thinking forward to how the team leader would be waiting for these results. I reached for the hypodermic. I inserted the needle into the vein. It made a dull sound. I pulled the red-black blood into the hypodermic. 3 cubic centimeters, 5 cubic centimeters. His face became paler. Before, he'd been moaning. Now he could not even moan. His throat was making a tiny rasping sound, like an insect. With resentment and anger in his eyes, He stared at me without even blinking. But that did not matter. I obtained a blood sample of 10 cubic centimeters. For people in laboratory work, this is ecstasy, and one's calling to his profession. Showing compassion for a person's death pains was of no value to me. At the lab, I possessed the blood sample quickly and then went back to look into the cell. His face occasionally twitched. His breath became shallower, and he went into his death throes. The other 4 men in the cell, who had the same fate waiting for them, could not contain their anger. They took water and poured it into the mouth of the dead man. This way, an irreplaceable life is trifled with to take the place of a guinea pig, and the result is 1 sheet of graph paper. 4 or 5 soldiers, with drawn guns, opened the door to the cell. It made a heavy sound. They dragged the dead man out into the corridor and loaded him onto a hand cart. The other 4 men, knowing what their fate would be tomorrow, could not hold down the anger in their eyes as they watched their dead companion leave. The handcart disappeared in the direction of the dissection room, with the tall chimney looming above. The researchers at Unit 731 had little to no experience examining the exposed organs of a living person. Hence, vivisection was a new procedure for them. As one former member of the unit remarked, the results of the effects of infection cannot be obtained accurately once the person dies because putrefactive bacteria set in. Putrefactive bacteria are stronger than plague germs. So, for obtaining accurate results, it is important whether the subject is alive or not. Doctors working in the unit would induce diseases in a subject and examine the effects on organs at the earliest stages. Anesthesia was used on an optional basis. The Latin maxim, primum non nocere, which is interpreted in medical schools as, above all, do no harm, obviously did not apply at Unit 731. A member of the staff described what happened once the subject's organs were examined to the doctor's satisfaction. As soon as the symptoms were observed, the prisoner was taken from his cell and into the dissection room. He was stripped and placed on the table, screaming, trying to fight back. He was strapped down, still screaming frightfully. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth. Then, with one quick slice of the scalpel, he was opened up. The victim did not always die immediately. Kuramizawa Masakuni described a scenario during which a woman woke during vivisection. She opened her eyes, and then she hollered. What did she say? Initially, he was unable to answer. Then he began to weep. He said, I don't want to think about it again. The man who interviewed him paused for a moment so Masakuni could get himself together. Once Masakuni was more composed, he was asked for an answer again. He said, She said, it's all right to kill me, but please spare my child's life. Indeed, many women were experimented upon in Unit 731. Many children were born in captivity in Unit 731. Some women were captured and placed in the unit while pregnant. Many others became pregnant when they were subjected to facilitated rape as part of an experiment involving the deliberate transmission of venereal disease. Mothers and children were frequently experimented on in gas chambers. No mothers who requested that their children be spared had their wishes granted. Shiro Ishii presented his findings to the Army Medical College in Tokyo on a regular basis. Not only did he present tables and graphs, but he took specimens with him. There were jars containing arms, legs, feet, organs. Some contained entire heads. He didn't stop there. There were whole body specimens. Additionally, he brought new bacteria that had been developed in the lab and preserved human specimens who had died from artificially induced pathological conditions. Eventually, the entire medical research community of Japan studied these materials. The usage of the term Unit 731 only became used commonly in August 1941. There were similar facilities doing the same work, so they all fell under the rubric of the mandate for medical research at the Pingfang location. And this was an outdoor testing lab. Tests conducted on plague, cholera, and other pathogens to be used in biological warfare, bombs, were carried out at this facility. They would expose human subjects to these diseases outdoors. They would test them out on 10 to 40 people at a time. The subjects were tied to crosses and circles. The scientists would test the bacteria as it was used from varied distances. Projectiles and infected insects were hurled at them. When the bombs were tested, the Maruta would wear a helmet and a metal plate was hung over their torso. It had nothing to do with concern for their welfare. The scientists didn't want to jeopardize their findings. Their mandate was to discover how the weapons affected living beings, after all. Xinjing, now named Changchun. This facility is where animal testing was done. Unit 100 was a bacteria manufacturer in its own right, making glanders, anthrax, and other pathogens along those lines. Some research on mixing poisons with food was done there. Guangzhou. It was also called NAMI Unit 8604. Its headquarters was at Zhongshan Medical University. In the Japan Times edition of November 8, 1994, a 77-year-old former staff member, Maruyama Shigeru, said one experiment carried out at this installation involved starving the inmates to death. Several prisoners brought in from Hong Kong perished after they were given water spiked with typhus-causing bacteria. Rats were raised there for the purpose of infecting them with plagues, which they were to spread if all went according to design. Beijing, Unit 1855. A Japanese documentary filmmaker examined this abandoned building. An extract from the narrative of the film. This is where large numbers of test tubes were all lined up on shelves. Each test tube was identified by a label showing what kind of bacteria it contained. 6 of them contained plague germs. Choi Hyung-shin was a trilingual translator who worked at Unit 1855, translating Chinese from inmates to the Japanese researchers. From his recollections, when I first arrived there, some 100 prisoners were already in the cells. Whenever the Japanese doctors made contact with the people being tested, they always did it through an interpreter. The test subjects were infected with plague, cholera, and typhus. Those not yet infected were kept in different rooms. There were large mirrors in the rooms with the subjects so that those undergoing testing could be observed better. I spoke with the prisoners using a microphone and looking through the glass panel, interpreting the questions from the doctors. Do you have diarrhea? Do you have a headache? Do you feel chilly? The doctors made very careful records of all the answers. With the typhus test, 10 people were forced to drink a mixture of the germs, and 5 of them were administered a vaccine. The 2 groups were kept separate from each other. The doctors watched them closely and questioned them through my interpretation, recording the answers. The vaccine proved effective with all 5 to whom it was administered. The other 5 suffered horribly. In the plague tests, the prisoners suffered with chills and fever and groaned in pain until they died. From what I saw, one person was killed every day. Eventually, being the middleman in all this torture of innocent people became too much for Shin, and he faked appendicitis so that he could get a break from it all and perhaps find a way to escape. Unfortunately, he was caught and was administered a water torture featuring water that was imbued with hot peppers. His lungs were permanently damaged, and he was treated intermittently in hospital for 50 years. Singapore. In September 1991, journalist Fan Ming-yen, writing for the Singapore Straits Times, that a Japanese biological warfare research facility had operated in Singapore. Up until this point, it had been rumored but never confirmed to have existed. Japan occupied Singapore in February 1942, so they were able to force their labs onto the Singaporean people. Othman Wok worked for the laboratory. He recalled picking fleas from rats and putting them in containers. Speaking of the experience overall, he said, "It was an unforgettable experience. It was the first time that I was doing something which made me feel like a medical student." Each flea would be placed in a test tube. The rats were injected with plague pathogens. Their stomachs were shaved, and the test tubes were inverted over the shaven area. The fleas would tumble down to the rats' stomachs and feed on them. By doing this, the rats were infected with plagues. According to Wok, all these tasks were carried out in the same room where he worked. The infected fleas were transferred to kerosene cans, which were filled with sand, dried horse blood, and some kind of chemical whose name and function was not conveyed to Wok. The fleas would be left in the cans to breed for about 2 weeks. Once this period was over, the infected fleas were transferred to flasks and shipped. Wok and the other boys his age who worked there were not told what the overall mandate of the work was. He was aware that they were working with dangerous materials, though. Not only did he have to wear protective gear, but on one occasion a rat bit through a researcher's glove, and the man died shortly thereafter. An Indian boy was bitten in the finger by a rat through his glove. He survived, but only after being rushed to hospital and having the tip of his finger amputated. A retired doctor who worked at the facility was not identified but agreed to be interviewed. A quote from an article published in the Straits Times on November 11, 1991. He said he was transferred to Singapore a week after the island was occupied in February 1942 from the main branch of Unit 731 in Harbin, Manchuria. Singapore was the headquarters of the Japanese Southern Army and the base to supply material to the war front. To prevent the outbreak of diseases in the city, strict bacteriological checks on water supply and fresh food were carried out. Hiroshima. A plant set up to produce chemicals and gases for warfare was set up in 1928. The chemicals were as dangerous to the workers who made them, who often emerged from their shifts disfigured and scarred. As far as gases went, they made ypirite, lewisite, and cyanogen. Mustard gas had also been made there. Insects and rodents. Plagues have been spread through the ages by rats and insects. It was long believed that rats spread the so-called Black Death, though recently scientists have concluded that the plague was spread through human contact. This was not known during World War II, and the Unit 731 scientists were keen to make rats into the perfect vessels to transmit plagues and diseases. 10 of the prisoners were tasked with the objective of raising fleas. Local farmers were paid to raise rats. The unit began the practice of injecting inmates with diseases to get a sense of how they impacted a person's body. The next step would be to experiment with treatment. In one area, dogs were injected with cholera and sent to live in a village. They caught strays and fed them pork laced with cholera. Once the dogs became ill, they would vomit. Soon, another dog would come along and eat the vomit and henceforth become infected. The same kind of thing happened with diarrhea. 20% of the humans who contracted the disease died. Those who survived recalled hearing the vocalizations of those who suffered from outside their homes. Kojima Takeo was a former army captain who was involved in the cholera experiments. To quote Takeo, "We were told that we were going out on a cholera campaign, and we were all given inoculations against cholera 10 days before starting out. Our objective was to infect all the people in the area. The disease had already developed before we got there, and as we moved into the village, everyone scattered. The only ones left were those who were too sick to move. The number of people coming down with the disease kept increasing. Cholera produces a face like a skeleton, vomiting and diarrhea. And the vomiting and defecating of the people lying sick brought flies swarming around. One after the other, people died." Epidemic hemorrhagic fever. On April 2nd, 1943, the Asahi newspaper published the following article. "Another victory shout for military medicine. Strange sickness in northern Manchuria, conquered pathogen for terrible hemorrhagic fever is discovered. The medical corps of the invincible Imperial Army raises another victory, a shout with a triumph over a strange and unusual disease in northern Manchuria that has been puzzling military and civilian medicine. It has been discovered that the disease is carried by ticks. Not only has the method of transmission of the disease been discovered, but a preventive measure has been established as well, and development of a treatment seems close at hand. The pathogen was unknown before this, and the discovery of a new type of carrier identified in May 1938 by the Imperial Army. At that time, the disease took the name of the locality where it occurred and other names. The Army exerted itself to identify this pathogen for the purposes of disease prevention within the Army and to advance sanitation in Manchuria. After the incubation period, a high fever develops and internal bleeding is present. The death rate is from 15 to 20%. Rats that were found to be carrying diseases also presented with ticks. The ticks would be removed from the rats and mixed into a saline solution. The researchers would inject monkeys with the solution. If the disease's classic symptoms manifested, blood would be drawn from the monkey and injected into another subject. The second subject would also be observed for the presence of symptoms. If the symptoms appeared, the subject would be dissected and its organs removed. Parts of the organs would be ground into a fine consistency. A saline solution containing an extract of the organ would, in turn, be injected into another subject. The process would continue along these lines until the pathogen was isolated. In the documentation of experiments, the researchers often wrote that tests were carried out on monkeys. The truth was that, quote-unquote, monkeys was a code word for humans. There are 330 different species of monkeys, and a scientist would most likely indicate which species he is working on to provide the most detailed and precise description of an experiment. Blanket terminology is generally avoided in the record-keeping aspect of experiments. October 1940. When it came to the Japanese Army's use of plagues as a weapon of war, the research and development phase was over, and they launched a full-on attack on the Chinese. They targeted the port city of Ningbo. Strategically, this location would serve their purposes well. Not only would they kill many of the town's citizens, but because imported goods were distributed from this busy commercial hub, the merchandise would be delivered to the general population of China. The plan was carried out with an affiliated unit, that being 1644. Their approach was to infect wheat, corn, cloth scraps, and cotton with plague germs. The materials were dropped from aircraft to the people. A Chinese national named Qian Guifa witnessed and survived this attack by plague. He was 14 years old at the time, so he had youth and health on his side. He was interviewed for a documentary decades later. He recounted his experience with this attack thusly. One day, a Japanese plane flew over and kept circling. Then, it dropped something that looked like smoke. It was wheat flour and corn and other things. The next day, people started getting sick. 3 days later, the tofu shop owner's 2 children were dead, and other people were getting sick and dying. Nobody could understand what had happened. My own family died, one after the other. There was misery all around. Everyone who died did so in pain and agony, going into convulsions. At first, the bodies turned red, then after death, they turned black. 100 people died just a few days after this attack. The area was cordoned off, and the public were forbidden to enter until the 1960s. It was confirmed at that point that there was no risk of infection. A Chinese man who specialized in disease prevention and plague detailed how he kept the plague from spreading to other districts. On the 29th, 3 days after the Japanese plane came, I entered the Ningbo area that had been attacked. The first thing I did was separate the people seriously affected, those lightly affected, and the healthy ones. Then, I encircled the infected area of the attack zone with a wall about 1 meter deep and 1.5 meters high, so that rats could not escape. 600 people were moved south. When November came, we burned everything in the enclosed area, and in this way, we stopped the plague from spreading. According to my records, 97 people died. September 1942. Another plague attack was carried out. This time Shiro Ishii was directly involved as a commander. This account was given by a survivor. I was 15 years old at the time, and I remember everything clearly. The Japanese plane spread something that looked like smoke. A few days later, we found dead rats all over the village. At the same time, people came down with high fevers and aches in the lymph nodes. Every day people died. Crying could be heard all through the village. My mother and father, in all, 8 people in my family, died. I was the only one in my family left. My mother had a high fever all day. She was crying for water and clawing at her throat. Then she let out a roar like a lion and died before my eyes. Altogether, 380 people in the village died. At times, as many as 20 people died in one day. As soon as the first people started dying, Japanese came into the village wearing protective clothing and masks. They went around the village for 3 days, giving injections to the people. They administered 2 shots, one to the arm and one to the chest. Some of the people who got these shots also died. A kilometer away, the Japanese army commandeered a house on top of a hill. The house would be used to facilitate a vivisection laboratory. A man named Qian Tangzheng recalled his experience with the biological warfare experiment. We were told that if we went to Rin's house at the top of the hill, we would get treated. My friend told me that his wife went to the house for treatment, and later was seen strapped to a table with her body split open. Her feet were still moving. There's no doubt that she was dissected alive. A woman named Wang Julian gave her account. 5 members of my family died. My mother and father both suffered from swollen lymph nodes, then a high fever. They died in agony. I was taken to Rin's house also, and I was there for 2 days. Then, the next day, the Japanese went into the village again, and I ran away. The villagers gave me herbal medicines, and in time my fever went down, and I lived through it. These attacks were easy for the Japanese army. They were carried out with slow-moving planes against people who were not fighting back. Plague attacks against people who would engage the Japanese army in conflict would not be so easily infected. The solution Shiro Ishii devised was to drop bombs containing infected insects and rats. Ultimately, the explosives that detonated the bombs killed the insects, so this method was found to be impractical for the Japanese killing machine. Frostbite. Some of the cruelest experiments conducted on human subjects at Unit 731 consisted of inducing frostbite. I have never experienced frostbite, but I have experienced tissue death on my right foot when I lost part of my right big toe to an infection. And, well, it is quite an experience to watch part of your body turn black and self-amputate. A similar process occurs in the event of frostbite, though the damage to the body and trauma to the victim are tenfold compared to what I went through. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist who attended the same medical program as Shiro Ishii, carried out the frostbite experiments. When the Japanese army fought against Russians in their territory, they found they were unprepared for the harsh Russian winters, and many soldiers were treated for frostbite. Japan has a varied climate, with cold winters in the mountainous areas, but subtropical temperatures in the southern regions. Still, none of their military personnel were able to withstand what Russians endure on an annual basis. The frostbite experiments at Unit 731 consisted of deliberately subjecting human guinea pigs to frostbite. The subjects were tied up with their arms bare and drenched with water. Water was thrown on their arms frequently throughout the experiments. Sometimes the temperatures the subjects were immersed in were so far below freezing that ice formed on their arms. The ice would be chipped away, and more water would be poured onto the appendage. The researcher would regularly strike the arm with a club. When striking the arm produced a sound akin to a wooden board being struck, it was concluded that the arm was frozen inside and out, and therefore frostbite was achieved. The next stage of the experiment was to try different forms of treatment. Legs and feet were immersed in similar subarctic temperatures. Sometimes during winter, Manchuria's temperatures can drop to 20 to 30 degrees Celsius below zero. Many of these tests were conducted outdoors in such conditions. Sometimes they would use electric fans to accelerate the freezing process. At the lab, Dr. Hisato had a refrigerated facility that could achieve even lower temperatures. In some of these experiments, the flesh and muscle would fall off the bones. In other cases, the bones became so embrittled that they shattered when they were struck with the club. The results of every approach were always the same: gangrene and the rotting of extremities. It is strange to think that certified physicians would be surprised at the result. I'm not a doctor, but even I know that such treatments cannot bring tissue back from the dead. Former staff of Unit 731 recall that those who survived the frostbite experiments had no hands and feet. Dr. Hisato found that soaking the affected limbs in warm water set between 37 degrees and 40 degrees Celsius which is typical human body temperature, was the best way to heal frostbite if it was possible. It's just unfortunate how many people lost their limbs before this conclusion was reached. Dr. Hisato would go on to be lauded by the medical community in Japan. He even became an instructor years later. His pupils were struck by the lack of moral scruples he demonstrated when he described the findings of his frostbite experiments. He never acknowledged that by intentionally inflicting suffering on his human subjects, he was committing egregious human rights violations. He may not have found it appalling, but others have, so much so that he was removed from the chairmanship of an academic organization. Protests by students against human experimentation led to him resigning from his post as the president of Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. A former army technician was asked about human experimentation. His response: "Human experimentation? Maybe my subordinates did that, but I never did. But you people are thinking wrong. Even that did happen, it was war. The orders came from the country. All the responsibility lies with the country. The individual is not responsible." June 1942. Despite Japan's sneak attack on America's Pearl Harbor, the country's fortunes amid the tumult of war were at a low ebb. The Battle of Midway represented the last of Japan's many victories in the Pacific. As a result, many territories that had been seized by Japan slipped through its grasp. The government and its military became desperate for a means to win the war, as defeat was now within the realm of possibility. Shiro Ishii did not hesitate to propose biological warfare as a solution to this crisis. The United States had nuclear bombs. Plague bombs, if detonated at the right time and place, could wipe out as many civilians as the nuclear warheads that would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. In 1944, America attacked the Japanese island of Saipan. Seizing this island would make it far too easy for the Americans to decimate Japan. Shiro Ishii gathered a team of 20 scientists to put together biological weapons in Saipan. However, en route to the island, their boat sank, and Japan's opportunity to launch biological warfare against America descended along with it. With the conclusion of World War II on the horizon, Japan was anxious to cover its tracks after realizing they would be condemned by the international community for crimes against humanity because of their experiments at the Unit 731 facilities. They bombed the buildings in the hope that all evidence of the experiments would be reduced to ashes. The problem was, their efforts to erect buildings that were resistant to bombings and fire worked against them in the end, and those who documented the horrors that went on in those structures would find a wealth of material to draw upon in their own research. Shiro Ishii instructed members of Unit 731 to never discuss the operation with others or among themselves. He ordered all documentation of the experiments destroyed, though he took some film footage and documents with him when he returned to Japan. Was Shiro Ishii prosecuted for his crimes against humanity? Not exactly. After 300,000 people were killed by Japanese biological warfare, he was granted immunity by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East by the government of the United States. Why did they grant him immunity? They wanted information and research for their very own biological warfare program, which he was all too happy to provide. More testimonials. This account was given by a Unit 731 researcher who has given their testimony under cloak of anonymity. I was working as a civilian employee at the Army Medical College in Tokyo. In July 1942, I was transferred to China, and the following month I was assigned to Unit 1644 in Nanjing. In October 1944, I became a member of the Army as an enlisted man in the Hygiene Corps. An associated unit of Unit 731 was set up in Nanjing shortly after that city fell into Japanese hands. Equipment and people were transferred from Harbin. Facilities were great. We even had a swimming pool. The grounds and buildings were superior, of a quality not to be found in Japan. Under the regime of Jiang Jieshi, this had originally been a people's hospital. The front of the hospital complex extended 200 meters, cut off by a high wall with a guard gate for egress. The grounds extended about 700 meters back from this front wall, and there was a large red cross at the top of the main building. Some buildings left over from earlier times served as facilities like a glass factory and a print shop. One part of the compound was made into a ranch for animals. A running creek separated the animal area from the rest of the compound and kept the animals from wandering outside the ranch. There was a bridge with a gate over the creek for people to cross over. Unit 1644 was classified as a battalion, but our budget was the same as that normally allotted to a regiment. People working in the unit were military doctors, medical specialists, interpreters, and civilian employees. Our activities included developing preventative vaccines, tending the animals, and drawing the animals' blood for vaccine research and production. A water purification team carried equipment out to different areas for water treatment. I was assigned to the vaccine group. There were 100 of us, about 10% of the total complement of the unit. Every day I would be given information on the previous day's work, including which army doctor performed what work, what results had been obtained, and so forth. I had the job of writing down all these details in a research statement. Then I stamped it secret and locked it in a safe. One day a Chinese man tried to take the written records. He was caught and arrested. Shortly afterward, an officer came from Japan, and I was promised an award. The war ended before I had a chance to get it. Everyone connected with human experiments wore a special button on the side of his hat. The Maruta were kept in cages on the top floor of a 3-story building. The cages were referred to as rotsu, probably from the Japanese katakana character ro, which is square in shape. The prison block at Pingfang was called rogo for this reason, and the floor where they were kept was always just called the 3rd floor. One had to pass through the main offices in order to get to the 3rd floor, where the cages were. The area where the prisoners were was sealed off with a door. 1 meter in front of the door and on its other side were disinfectant mats to prevent bacteriological contaminants from being carried outside on people's shoes. Inside the door, the room was about 10 by 15 meters with cages all in a row. Most of the Maruta in the cages were just lying down. In the same room were oil cans with mice that had been injected with plague germs and with fleas feeding on the mice. These were not the usual types of fleas, but a transparent variety. Around the perimeter of the room was a 30-centimeter wide trough of running water. The purpose of the trough, which is wider than the distance over which the fleas can leap, is apparent to keep the fleas from going outside the room. Next to the dissection room was the specimen room. Every year when the new soldiers came in, the first job they got was cleaning up at night around the human specimen room. The other soldiers would put a dish of fireflies in the specimen room by the window facing the corridor. The fireflies swarming around the specimens of body parts created an eerie feeling, and some of the young recruits suffered emotional problems from the experience. The following is a lecture given by Nishino Rumiko on the subject of Unit 731 and the so-called comfort women. A Korean woman who served in the Japanese military brothels used the Japanese name Haruko. This was a popular name for non-Japanese women, including comfort women, to adopt. A Japanese soldier she knew developed a fever, and Haruko heard of this and went to take care of him. A personal warmth grew between the two. After that, they were both transferred to Burma. Haruko to an army brothel, the soldier to his new duty post. In Burma, the soldier searched for the comfort woman who had helped him, inquiring at the military brothels there, but without success. In 1944, with the war going badly for Japan, the soldier was sent to work at a quarantine station in Harbin. And there, fate brought him into a meeting again with Haruko. It was a brief meeting. The soldier expressed his gratitude with some small gifts, including a fountain pen and some money, and asked for a way to contact Haruko in the future. Japan was headed for defeat, and he looked forward to meeting her again after the war. They never did meet. Then, in recent years, the comfort woman problem started surfacing. Survivors among them who suffered shame and stigma for decades have slowly started coming forward, some seeking apology from Japan, others seeking compensation. With all this attention focused on the comfort women of the 30s and 40s, the former soldier, now in his 80s, is sending out an appeal to help him search once more for Haruko. The former soldier contacted me, and I went to visit him. He told me his story, that he had been a technician and a member of Unit 731 working in the plague research section, but he had another job, giving health examinations to comfort women. Once a week, the women were examined for venereal disease, and he was working in this capacity when he met Haruko at the quarantine station in Harbin in 1944. His work with the comfort women involved taking blood samples from them and sending the samples to Unit 731 for analysis. I have searched out another member of Unit 731 who was also assigned to examining comfort women for venereal disease. He visited the various brothels, at times examining up to 100 women a day. Studies of venereal disease were fairly extensive, yet many Japanese books on Unit 731 make no mention of this area. I went into the records of the only court examination of Unit 731 members, the Khabarovsk trials. There were, in fact, trials in China, too. And in the second part of these records was a lengthy record which was released in Japan in the early part of 1950. There was doubt as to its authenticity, but careful corroboration showed it to be true, and within the records it was reported that there was a venereal disease research group within Unit 731. One Japanese writer, Morimura Seiichi, the novelist who has gained a name as a researcher and writer on Unit 731, wrote that venereal disease research was conducted by the tuberculosis research group in Unit 731 under the group leader Futagi. This was supported by the Khabarovsk court records. Morimura was researching former unit members for his writings. He searched out Futagi in Tokyo and found him still healthy, but unwilling to speak on his past work with Unit 731. Futagi later died with his lips sealed. With the team leader gone, the probe continued, looking for possible survivors among other members of the same team. I searched municipal records and located one man who was then in a hospital in Nagano Prefecture. I traveled there and spoke with him at his bedside. I asked about Unit 731, and he spoke freely about different aspects and activities. Then I asked him about experiments on women. His attitude changed. His lips closed tightly, and he refused to speak further. I saw that he was fatigued, and since he was over 80 years old, I didn't want to press him in his condition, so I left the hospital. But the subject was on my mind. I decided to go back again the next day. I avoided any mention of experiments on women, and we talked about his post-war life. He told me of how he had come back to Japan, given up his intentions of working as a doctor, and lived secluded in the country, subsisting on the food he grew himself. I heard his story, thanked him for spending time with me, and started to leave the room to return to Tokyo. Just as I reached the door, he called to me to wait. Last night I thought about our talk, he told me. I had decided to take this with me to hell, but I thought it over, and now I want to leave it in this world. Tears came to his eyes, like a waterfall. Until then, he had shown no emotion, but at that moment he changed and told his story. He had performed vivisections on 6 living women. The one experience he did not want to speak of was that concerning a Chinese woman. In vivisections on living persons, sometimes chloroform is used to put the victim to sleep. At times it is not, and the person is cut open fully conscious. This particular Chinese woman, he told me, was put under chloroform but regained consciousness on the table. She started getting up, screaming, "Go ahead and kill me, but please don't kill my child." There were 4 or 5 of us working on the vivisection, he told me. We held her down, applied more anesthesia, and continued. He has told me that he has carried that memory ever since. He felt that bringing it out would place the other surviving members of the team in a different position. So for 50 years, he had been determined to take that to hell with him. I managed to find one more person who had been a member of the Futagi team for a limited time. He had been a candidate to become a sub-unit leader under Ishii. He did not get this position, but later became Ishii's private driver and assistant. Here is what he told me. At first, we infected women with syphilis by injection, but this method did not produce real research results. Syphilis is normally transmitted through direct contact. Investigating the course of the disease can offer no useful results unless it is acquired this way. And so we followed a system of direct infection through sexual contact. The reason Unit 731 researched venereal disease was because of the Japanese Army's practice of using comfort women. By learning how the disease develops, we tried to find a way to protect Japanese soldiers from sexually transmitted disease. We were very limited in methods of treating venereal disease at the time, mainly just one type of injection. And a Japanese soldier catching venereal disease would not only be barred from promotion, but in some units, he would be reduced in rank and placed in detention while he was being treated for it. So to an army man, catching venereal disease was a disgrace and a setback. As a result, many infected soldiers kept quiet about their infection and tried to get cured secretly. Venereal disease grew into a very serious problem in the military. In Siberia, for example, the prices for going to a comfort woman station were prohibitively high compared with the salary of the Japanese soldier. So the soldiers took their pleasures by raping local Russian women. This led to an outbreak of venereal disease, with huge numbers of Japanese soldiers afflicted. The brass at Japanese headquarters saw their soldiers falling to venereal disease, and the problem became grave. The Marco Polo Bridge incident and the rape of Nanjing took place in 1937. There were 20,000 recorded incidents of rape against Russian women during the period in the 5-month span between those events alone. With the spread of venereal disease among the ranks and its threat to the discipline and efficiency of the Army, it was natural for the High Command to look to an Army medical unit for solution to the problem, and Unit 731 was called upon. Infection of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and the researchers started forcing the prisoners into sexual acts with each other 4 or 5 unit members dressed in white laboratory clothing, completely covering the body with only eyes and mouth visible, handled the tests. A male and female, one infected with syphilis, would be brought together in a cell and forced into sex with each other. It was made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. Once the healthy partner was infected, the progress of the disease would be observed closely to determine, for example, how far it advanced the first week, the second week, and so forth. Instead of merely looking at external signs, such as the condition of the sexual organs, researchers were able to employ live dissection to investigate how different internal organs are affected at different stages of the disease. The victimization and suffering of women under Unit 731 had not been given much attention in accounts of Unit 731's activities until the comfort women issue was brought to the surface. The focus was largely on a racial basis, how the Chinese and Russians and Koreans were victimized. Now it has become clear how women have suffered as women, and attention is being directed to this issue also. Another issue being brought closer to the fore now is that of children. Yoshimura Hisato, one of his experiments was with a 3-month-old baby. A temperature-sensing needle was injected into the baby's hand, and the infant was immersed in ice water. Their temperature changes were carefully recorded. After the war, he issued a paper on this experiment and the results. Since it would have been impossible to conduct an experiment like this in post-war years, it became obvious that this was conducted when he was with Unit 731. From this, we can understand that he used babies born to imprisoned mothers. Records from China identify babies being born to pregnant captives, and also to women made pregnant through forced sex in venereal disease experiments. And these babies were also made use of in the unit's experiments. One of the former researchers I located told me that one day he had a human experiment scheduled, but there was still time to kill. So, he and another unit member took the keys to the cells and opened one that housed a Chinese woman. One of the unit members raped her. The other member took the keys and opened another cell. There was a Chinese woman in there who had been used in a frostbite experiment. She had several fingers missing, and her bones were black, with gangrene set in. He was about to rape her anyway. Then he saw that her sex organ was festering, with pus oozing to the surface. He gave up the idea, left, and locked the door, then later went on to his experimental work. This speaker, giving an account of his days as a member of the Japanese Youth Corps, told his story about his time serving Unit 731. I preserved a lot of human lab specimens in formalin. Some were heads, others were arms, legs, internal organs, and some were entire bodies. There were large numbers of these jars lined up, even specimens of children and babies. When I first went into that room, I felt sick and couldn't eat for days, but I soon got used to it. Specimens of entire bodies were labeled and identified by nationality, age, sex, and the date and time of death. Names were not identified. There were Chinese, Russians, and Koreans, and also Americans, Britons, and Frenchmen. Specimens could have been dissected at this unit or sent in from other subunits. I couldn't tell. The glass specimen cases were made by a unit member who had studied glass manufacture in Europe. He made pipettes and all types of glass lab equipment, and he gave me presents of small glass birds he made. I was given work to do during dissections. I had jobs like carrying buckets full of blood and internal organs. Once, I was allowed to use a scalpel and cut open a maruta. I made a long cut from the neck down and cut the body open. It's simple. Anyone can do it. After that, the specialists did the fine work. In order to obtain accurate data from dissection, researchers want to have the Maruta in as normal state as possible. Usually they were put to sleep with chloroform, but some were tied down and cut open while fully conscious. At first, the Maruta would let out a hideous scream, but soon the voice would stop. The organs would be removed, conditions such as color and weight would be compared with healthy conditions, and then the organs would be preserved. At Xinjiang, I worked with the hygiene team conducting what they called manju exams. A manju is a bun filled with sweet bean jam. The word is a slang term for a woman's sex organ. The official name was disease prevention exams. We went from one brothel to the next, checking the women for syphilis. They had to get on their hands and knees with their buttocks raised for the exam. On a busy day, we examined up to 180 women. Syphilis would cause a woman's manju to swell up. Once during an examination, pus discharged from the woman's organ and hit the examiner in the face. A sample of her blood was taken to the unit for analysis and proved syphilitic. The boss ordered us to dig up the bodies of people who had died from the epidemic, dissect them, remove and preserve their organs, and send the specimens back to unit headquarters. In some cases, mobile units came with orders to exhume the bodies and open them up, and then to take small specimens from lungs, livers, and kidneys and apply each to a petri dish. Organs that tested positive for the plague were taken back to the unit. The petri dishes of plague germs we gathered were taken to the Xinjiang National Hygiene Laboratory and cultivated, then sent to the boss. That was the most distasteful job I had, violating people's graves. This story was told by a hygiene officer. The Special Forces men had taken a lot of photos. They were big bodies with no heads, with no feet, with swollen bellies. That was from water torture. They forced water into the body to swell up the belly. My buddy Mikami told me, I saw the whole thing. It was really hideous. I told him, that's war. I killed people for the country, for the emperor. That was my belief then. In the autumn of 1943, Warrant Officer Murakami committed suicide. He had come to Manchuria with his young wife. He had thrown bacteria into the water supply near a Special Forces detachment, and several people drank that water and died. Strong words came from the Special Forces officers. Why did he throw that into the water? The main work of the unit was supposed to be water sampling. Maybe when people came up and accused us of making them sick, it was too much for him. A few days after that, the fellow who always worked with Murakami, Sergeant Murayama, committed suicide. Maybe he was under pressure from the officers. I had heard rumors about the dissections, and I wondered if those things really happened. I thought that if they had really happened, they were wretched acts. But personally, I feel no shame. I thought that I was really doing a good thing. Former Kenpaitai member Awasaki described the water torture in detail. There were special tables such as the one at the exhibition built for this purpose, but sometimes an ordinary bench or ladder was used. I first saw this device when I was assigned to the Harbin branch. I thought it was a very handy system and was delighted with it. I used it for 6 years until the end of the war. Yet many officials who participated in the invasion never saw one, and even some Kenpaitai officers are seeing it for the first time at these exhibits. The victim is placed naked on the board, face up. The head is held immobile inside a wooden box frame fixed at the end of the board. The arms and legs are strapped down. The victim is not able to move, no matter how great the suffering. If a hose is used to force water into the mouth, as had been the case previously, the victim can evade some of the water. A different system was devised, an easier one whose results are more complete. First, water is poured on the chest to prevent a heart attack. A cloth is placed over the mouth and nose, and water is trickled over it slowly. The cloth becomes saturated, and no matter how much the victim tries to fight, water enters the body, and in 5 or 6 minutes the belly swells. This is continued until the desired confession is obtained. The reason for devising this system was that it was easy to use and did not leave any visible scars as evidence of torture. There were occasional parties to commemorate someone's work. A committee would decide on carrying out executions while everyone was drinking sake. There was one officer who was especially fond of executions. He would have about 5 persons sit in front of a ditch, then behead them and kick the bodies into the ditch. These particular executions apparently had no scientific aims. Well said. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.